And now guys, I want to show you an endgame with white having an extra pawn and black trying to stop the pawn from promoting so he doesn't get checkmated by queen. So if ever you get a chance to play this endgame, make sure you know to put your king in front of the pawn because the king is a bodyguard of the pawn and he protects the pawn at all times with his body. He says, nope, can't go here, can't go there. I'm protecting all the squares. So when the bad guy comes, I call him the criminal. The bad guy is going to try to steal my pawn away from me. My king will always stop him. So as he comes over here, my king makes sure that he can't because my king controls the squares in front of the pawn, making the way, rolling the carpet for the pawn to become a president someday. So let's see how this would work in real life. Okay, my king steps up, his king steps up, my king steps up, and his king takes something called opposition. So what is opposition? Is when the kings face each other, and whoever has to go away, whoever has to lose opposition, is on the losing side of the opposition basically. So, for example, right now he's facing me and I have to lose opposition because I have to go away, and then he can try to get in front. Or he can copy me and make sure that my king can't get to the end where he wants to go. If my king gets to this square or this square, and if my king controls the queeny square and the two squares behind the queeny square, then I won the game and my pawn will get to the end. But first I have to walk up all the way over there while protecting my pawn. Let's see how I can do that. Thankfully, my pawn can make a waiting move. So I just say, go on. Now I have the position because the opponent has to go away, and then I control those squares. So for example, when the black king goes to e6, I will go to c5, and now I control these three squares. I roll up the carpet so my pawn can start rolling, right? The king will try to go back, and once again I take opposition. Wherever the king goes, I'll go the other way. So now I control these three squares and I roll up my carpet. We call this outflanking. So I outflank the king by first taking a position and then going the other way. So kind of squeezing him back. If he tries to go for my pawn, I quickly roll up my pawn. So my pawn starts rolling all the way up to here where my king is still protecting the square. So the black king has to run back and I go forward. Now the worst thing you can do is take the pawn and put it on the same rank as your king because now the king can't get in front of the pawn. It's too late and now this is gonna be a draw. For example, check here, and then my king doesn't want to do it, but he has to. If he wants to protect the pawn, he has to go here, and guess what? It's stalemate. The king has nowhere to go. He can't go to c8 or e8 or e7 and c7, and he can't capture the pawn, but he's not in check, so it's a stalemate, and we didn't win. So what we had to do there was actually put the king in front of the pawn, always in front of the pawn, and when the king goes away, we outflank him for the last time. We control these three squares, we roll up the carpet, and the pawn starts rolling. So for example, king goes here, check, king goes there, check, and we got our queen, and we can do the checkmate with the queen, which I covered in another lecture. So as the defending side, how do we hold the draw? Well, we can only make a draw if we get a position, and the opponent's king, so the king with the pawn, is either on the same rank as the pawn or behind the pawn. If he's behind the pawn, then he can't promote it because the king cannot roll up the carpet for the pawn to promote. And I will make sure that the king can't go in front of the pawn. That's my criminal's job, to make sure this guy stays back and I'm always in the way, pushing back against the pawn. Let's see how this works. Let's say white plays king to e2. My king always goes backwards of the pawn. So if the pawn is on d3, I always want to go back to d5 so that after the king comes to e3, I can take a position with king e5 and I make sure the king can't squeeze me, outflank me anywhere because I got all his squares. And when he tries pushing the pawn, that's okay. Then the pawn is ahead of the king, so the pawn cannot get to the end because the bodyguard is in the wrong place, right? So let's say I can go back right now. He goes here. Okay, I take a position once again. He gives me a check, no problem, and I go backwards to the pawn. He goes here. I always copy him to make sure I get opposition. Opposition is when the kings are one square apart, and they're facing each other, right? There are different types of oppositions, and we'll discuss them later, but this is the basic, primary, number one type of opposition that you'll see. Just two kings with one square apart looking at each other. He tries to squeeze, no problem, and he goes here. I always go backwards of the pawn, step right back, not to this side, because this one actually loses, and I'll show you why. Not to this side, but always back, so that if he goes right, I go right, and if he goes left, I go left, and I always copy him, and when he does the check, no problem, and then it's stalemate like we saw before. What would happen if the king stepped on the wrong square? Like, for example, I'll put a pawn here, the king goes here. This is not too bad because I can still wait, but when it gets to the final rank, I have to go backwards with the pawn. If I step on the wrong square, let's imagine that the king is over here, right? And I stepped on the wrong square. Okay, now he wins because first, he gets a position. And second, if I go to c8, he pushes the pawn, he's got the royal carpet. And if I go to e8 trying to blockade the pawn from getting a queen, then he does what we call the big squeeze. So he squeezes the black king out of the promotion square. And when my king has to go away because he has no other choice, he has to go to f7, then the white king takes over d7 and gets the royal carpet. And when he gets the royal carpet, there is no one that can stop the black pawn. So he just goes here, next move, gets a queen no matter what, and should win the game if he knows how to do the queen and king checkmate. So remember, if you're defending, make sure the opponent can't get the king above the pawn. Make sure to always have his pawn ahead of the king or on the same rank as the king, and that should be a draw. But if you're attacking, your number one goal, just get the king in front of the pawn. And then slowly but surely squeeze him back. So we do something like this. And then as you're squeezing him back, you're pushing the pawn along the royal carpet until you get to the end. The other position I wanted to show you guys, now we know opposition, is this one right here. So let's put 3 pawns on each side. Let's put the kings on symmetrical squares, e2 and e7, and then I'll give white 1 extra pawn on the a3 square. Should white win? Let's say the whole game we were playing very good chess, but we're still not winning if we don't know how to promote the pawn and how to win this pawn endgame. Should the pawn run and hope that the black king doesn't catch up? No, because there's something called the rule of the square. So here is how you measure the square of the pawn. I take the pawn itself, the a3 square. I count how many squares I need to promote. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 5 squares up. And then I go 5 squares diagonally. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Diagonally towards the black king, towards the opponent. And then I go 5 squares to the right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I join my square. That's the square of the pawn. If the black king is inside the square or can get into the square with his move, so right now he just stepped into the square, and now he can catch my pawn because the pawn is just as fast as the king. So if the king is in the square, the king will catch the pawn. For example, I go here, he's in the square, he's in the square, he's in the square, and now the black king is gonna catch up to my pawn and take it just as I was about to get a queen. He can steal it from me. So it would be silly to push this pawn because I know I can't get to the end. I could try using my king to help. So I would start pushing the pawn, but once again, as we said before, my king should be in front of the pawn, and I can't really get that now, can I? So the easiest way to win when you have an extra pawn, and it's an outside pawn. What outside pass pawn means is that the pawn is on the side, way out there, not in the middle, not on this side, but on the outside of play. So then I can leave the pawn here as far back as I can, preferably a2, and then I start going towards his pawns. And these guys will be my heroes today because they will become my queens. So as he starts going to my pawn, he can have it because I'll just take his, right? I go here, he goes there, I go to e7, he takes my pawn, but now I take all his pawns and get a queen. Now, some of you may say, but what if he just stays around here and protects his pawns. Slowly but surely, first I want to get a position, and then when the king tries to stay here, I start pushing my pawn. He goes there, I start pushing my other pawns. He goes here, I slowly bring up my pawn, so probably something like king to d4. He tries to stay within this square of the pawn and protecting this pawns, but he's split between two goals and he can't do both at the same time. So eventually, when I get to the right point, so let's say the king goes here, I can even sacrifice the pawn, so I shoot it up so it can become a queen, and even if he does get it, that's okay, because I can get to his pawn. So let's say I go here, the king takes, and now I'll get to his pawns. I will make my pawns queens. And if he doesn't get it, well, guess what? I shoot up the pawn all the way to the end, and if he tries to stop me, then I just promote the pawn. At some point, he has to go there. And at that point, I will go towards his pawns and make a queen on the king side by taking all of his pawns and promoting my h pawn. So, guys, remember opposition and remember that you don't always need to promote the pass pawn. You can give up the pass pawn, especially if it's an outside pass pawn, in order to queen your